In the chronicles of human cruelty, few names echo with such dread as Vlad III of Wallachia, a prince whose legacy was carved not from the glory of conquest, but from the suffering of those who crossed his path. He lived in an age when brutality was common currency, yet even in that blood-soaked century, his methods stood apart. To his people, he was a protector who stemmed the tide of the Ottoman advance. To his enemies, a demon cloaked in royal robes. Between those two perceptions lies the truth, a truth so grotesque, it blurred the line between history and nightmare. The 15th century was a time when Europe trembled beneath the expanding shadow of the Ottoman Empire. Wallachia, a small and fractured principality nestled between Hungary and the Danube frontier, stood as a fragile buffer. It was a land cursed by geography, too rich to be ignored, too weak to stand alone. Rulers rose and fell with frightening regularity. Loyalty shifted with the wind, and into this cauldron of chaos was born a boy who would one day be remembered as Vlad Dracula, the son of the dragon. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian knightly brotherhood sworn to defend Christendom against the Turks. Yet even the dragon could not escape the viper pit of Balkan politics. When alliances turned sour, the Ottomans demanded hostages to guarantee Wallachia's obedience. And so, around the age of 12, young Vlad and his brother Radu were delivered into Ottoman custody, children traded as political collateral. It was there, within the opulent yet merciless court of the sultans, that Vlad's education began, not in letters or philosophy, but in the anatomy of fear. He learned how the Ottomans maintained obedience not through love or loyalty, but through ritualized terror. Public executions were not justice, they were theater, performed before crowds to display the empire's absolute power. He saw men impaled on stakes, their bodies twitching like grotesque marionettes, while the soldiers prayed impassively nearby. For years, he lived amid the scent of decay and incense, a captive, forced to admire the efficiency of cruelty. Those lessons seared themselves into his soul. He watched his captors' discipline, their order, their terrifying calm. In his mind, fear became not an evil to be avoided, but a weapon to be mastered. When he was finally released, the world he returned to was unrecognizable. His father had been betrayed and killed by Wallachian boyars' noble families, whose shifting loyalties had doomed countless rulers before him. His elder brother Messiah was buried alive, his eyes torn from his face. Wallachia itself was splintered, ravaged by rival factions, its throne a blood-stained seat that devoured anyone who dared to occupy it. In that moment, something inside Vlad broke, or perhaps solidified. He had seen what mercy earned, nothing but betrayal. And so, when he seized the throne in 1456, he vowed that fear, not forgiveness, would rule in his stead. The young prince, scarcely 25, inherited a realm of ash. Villages lay abandoned, peasants starved, nobles schemed, and beyond the mountains the Ottomans waited like wolves. He had no great army, no wealthy treasury, no stable allies, but he possessed something rarer, an understanding of how terror could bind a nation more tightly than faith or loyalty ever could. His transformation began quietly. First, he tested loyalty among the nobles who had supported his father's murder. He invited them to his court, listened to their flatteries, studied their smiles. They expected the usual games of politics, bribes, favors, shifting alliances. Vlad offered them something else. For those who betrayed him, there would be no exile, no ransom, no pardon. There would only be the stake. Impalement, already known in Eastern Europe, became under Vlad's rule a carefully perfected ritual. He forbade sharp stakes those brought death too quickly. Instead, his carpenters shaped the ends blunt, polished them smooth, oiled them to ease entry. The victim would be forced down upon it, the stake guided with terrible precision through the body to avoid vital organs. The executioners knew their art well. A man could hang there, alive, for hours, sometimes for days, his screams fading only when life finally surrendered to exhaustion. It was horror elevated to statecraft. Soon, his roads were lined with what foreign travelers called forests of the impaled rows of human beings left to rot beneath the crows. To peasants and merchants, the message was unmistakable. The prince's justice was absolute. And remarkably, it worked. Crime vanished. Thieves fled across borders. Merchants began to travel without fear, knowing that none dared rob them under Vlad's rule. Even the Ottomans, veterans of countless brutal campaigns, whispered uneasily about the Wallachian voivode, who punished treachery with artistry. Yet behind the iron mask of the ruler was still a man shaped by childhood terror. At night, it was said, he walked alone along the ramparts of Targovishte, the moonlight glinting off his armor, staring into the black forests as if seeing ghosts among the trees. Perhaps he believed he was restoring order to a lawless world. Perhaps he simply could not escape the lesson learned in captivity, that compassion was a luxury for those who never feared betrayal. He dined among the impaled, they said, sipping wine as the dying twitched before him. Foreign chroniclers wrote of his calm demeanor, his measured speech, his fascination with precision. To them, he seemed less a man than a surgeon of suffering, dissecting the human spirit to find where obedience began and rebellion ended. But to many of his subjects, he was a savior. The Ottomans halted their raids. The roads grew safe, and for the first time in decades, peasants could till their fields without the shadow of bandits or Turkish tax collectors. It is one of history's cruelest paradoxes. The same man who terrified the world brought his people a kind of peace. In the Europe of the 15th century, tales of his punishments traveled faster than any army. Merchants spoke of a ruler who impaled thieves beside the stolen goods they had taken. Envoys whispered of men boiled alive in cauldrons or skinned in strips for disloyalty. But what most disturbed those who heard his name was not the brutality, it was the method. Every act of cruelty served a purpose. Every stake, every scream, every mutilated body became part of a vast design, a nation held together by terror. By the late 1450s, his reputation had already begun to take on the quality of myth. To his enemies, he was a demon in human flesh. To his subjects, he was a stern angel with a sword in each hand. And somewhere between those legends stood a man haunted, brilliant, merciless, who believed that only through fear could order be reborn from chaos. As his throne grew secure, so too did his ambition. He had silenced the boyars, purged the thieves, frightened the peasants into obedience. Now he turned his gaze outward to the empires beyond his borders. The Ottoman tide still pressed northward, and Vlad, forged by their cruelty, was ready to show his former captors that he had learned their lessons far too well. What began as vengeance was about to become a philosophy, a doctrine of terror as governance, more efficient and enduring than any sword. In the coming years, the world would witness horrors that defied imagination, and the young prince who once trembled before executioners would become their master, crafting spectacles of death so theatrical that even the devil himself might have looked away. The forests of the impaled were only the beginning. When the spring of 1459 arrived, the forests of Wallachia were heavy with silence. Beneath the still air, something new was stirring, a theatre of fear that would etch Vlad's name into eternity. His reign, once defined by survival, now turned toward retribution, and it began, as all horrors do, under the guise of celebration. That Easter, Vlad invited the most powerful noble families of Wallachia, the very boyars who had murdered his father and brother, to a grand banquet at Targovishte. The invitation was disarming, a feast of reconciliation, a chance to heal old wounds. The lords came dressed in velvet and gold, their wives glittering with jewels, children at their sides. The banquet hall glowed with candlelight and laughter. Goblets overflowed with red wine, the scent of roast meat filled the air, and for a brief moment, even the wary began to believe in peace. Then, when the wine reached its sweetest note, Vlad rose from his seat. His voice was calm, steady, almost kind. He spoke of betrayal, of loyalty, of the bloodline of Wallachia, how fragile it was, how often poisoned by deceit. His guests listened, perhaps thinking they were being flattered. Then the tone shifted. His eyes, sharp as blades, swept the room. "You betrayed my father," he said quietly. "You buried my brother alive." At that signal, the doors slammed shut. The guards moved in. Panic erupted, silks tore, goblets shattered, screams rose and were silenced. The elderly nobles were dragged from their chairs, their protests drowned by the clash of steel. In the courtyard outside, rows of sharpened stakes waited like a forest of wooden serpents. The impalements began before dawn. Witnesses said Vlad stood among them, hands clasped behind his back, directing the height and angle of each stake. The old nobles were placed highest, their bodies displayed against the sky like grotesque banners. Below them, their sons and servants, each carefully positioned so that none could die without seeing the suffering of the others. By the time the sun rose, The feast hall had become a mausoleum. The younger nobles and their families, spared only temporarily, were marched hundreds of kilometers to Castle Poenari, Vlad's mountain fortress. Forced to work as slaves, they hauled stone, dug foundations, and built the very citadel that would imprison them until death. Many perished beneath the weight of their labor. Others, too weak to continue, were simply added to the walls they had built, sealed into the structure like ghosts. This single act annihilated an entire generation of Wallachian nobility. And yet, for all its savagery, it brought a grim stability. The boyars' ancient rivalries ended overnight. None dared conspire again. The land fell silent beneath a ruler who had proven that treachery would be punished, not merely with death, but with legendary agony. Rumors of the Easter feast spread like wildfire across Europe. Diplomats in Buda and Krakow whispered his name with unease. Traders arriving from the east described towns where the air stank of decay, where the trees themselves seemed to bleed. A German merchant named Jakob Rem wrote that upon reaching Targovishte, he found the city square transformed into a garden of death. Hundreds of men and women impaled in concentric rings, their faces frozen in terror, their bodies in various stages of decay. He and his companions covered their noses with cloth, soaked in wine to endure the stench. Even hardened soldiers turned pale. To the Ottoman Empire, however, Vlad was not merely a curiosity. He was a threat, a defiant Christian prince whose defiance mocked their dominance. And he knew it, so when a delegation of Ottoman ambassadors arrived to negotiate tribute, he greeted them with apparent courtesy. They bowed low but refused to remove their turbans, citing religious custom. Vlad smiled thinly, dangerously. "Then I shall help you," he said, "to keep them on forever." At his command, the guards stepped forward, hammers in hand. Long iron spikes pierced through the ambassadors' turbans and into their skulls, fixing the cloth to bone. The victims were impaled soon after, still wearing their blood-soaked headwear. Their bodies were displayed along the road to Constantinople, a grotesque declaration that diplomacy held no power in the land of Dracula. It was an act of defiance so unthinkable that even Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, was reportedly shaken. Soon after, the Sultan gathered one of the largest armies of his reign to march on Wallachia. But Vlad had no intention of facing him in open battle. Instead, he turned his country into a living nightmare. His forces burned their own villages, poisoned wells, slaughtered livestock, and dragged entire populations into the mountains. The land between the Danube and Targovishte became a charnel plain, a maze of corpses, smoke, and traps. Ottoman scouts reported villages where the dead sat propped on benches, dressed as if alive, until soldiers approached and saw the stakes rising through their torsos. And at the heart of this hell waited the forest of the impaled. When Mehmed's vanguard reached it, they found over 20,000 bodies impaled in orderly ranks. Ottoman prisoners, peasants, thieves, women, even children. Their flesh was blackened by the sun, their eyes picked clean by crows. The air shimmered with heat and the reek of rot. The Sultan, who had seen every form of battlefield horror, ordered a retreat. He is said to have muttered, "How can we fight a man who does not fear the devil? For he is the devil himself." But the campaign did not end there. At midnight on the 17th of June 1462, Vlad launched one of the most daring raids in medieval history, the night attack on Mehmed's camp. Dressed in black, his soldiers moved like shadows through the enemy lines. Their torches were snuffed, their horses' hooves wrapped in cloth. They struck without warning, cutting through tents, slaughtering sleeping soldiers, aiming for the Sultan's own pavilion. The chaos was total fire, screams, confusion. Ottoman troops turned their blades on each other in panic. Though Vlad failed to kill Mehmed, the raid achieved its true purpose: terror. As he retreated, Vlad left behind hundreds of Ottoman prisoners impaled along the road, their bodies swaying in the night breeze. Their dying moans carried across the fields, a macabre hymn that followed the invaders all the way back to the Danube. His message was unmistakable. This land cannot be conquered, it can only devour you. Even among his allies, his tactics inspired awe and disgust in equal measure. A Hungarian diplomat named Toma Katavolos later recalled being invited to dine at Vlad's castle, where the windows overlooked a courtyard filled with the impaled. When the stench overwhelmed him, Vlad offered a cruel jest. "If the smell offends you, my friend, we can have you raised higher where the air is cleaner." This was the theater of terror pain as performance, cruelty as communication. Vlad understood that an army's greatest weakness was not the body, but the mind. Fear could starve a campaign, paralyze a city, and destroy empires. In an age before mass media, Vlad Dracula was the master of psychological warfare. His victims were his message. Each stake was a proclamation. Each scream an instrument in his orchestra of fear. For the people of Wallachia, his reign was both hell and salvation. Bandits vanished. Foreign invaders hesitated. Merchants traveled freely, though their eyes avoided the forests where crows gathered thick as storm clouds. To live under Vlad was to exist between awe and terror, to bless his protection by day, and pray not to anger him by night. Across Europe, chroniclers could not agree on what manner of creature he was. Some called him tyrant, others saint. The Germans printed pamphlets describing him as Satan's spawn. The Romanians sang ballads of their savior. But whether angel or devil, no one could deny that his reign changed the rules of power itself. He had proven that fear could rule longer than faith, that the shadow of one man's cruelty could halt armies, silence kingdoms, and linger centuries after his bones turned to dust. Yet behind every masterpiece of terror lies the artist's undoing. Vlad's genius for fear would soon turn inward, consuming the realm it had once protected. All empires of horror, after all, eventually devour their creators. By the year 1462, the land that had once feared Vlad the Impaler now trembled beneath the weight of his obsession. His enemies were terrified, his allies uneasy, and his people lived under a sky heavy with smoke. What had begun as righteous vengeance had hardened into paranoia. Vlad saw betrayal in every shadow, treachery in every whispered prayer. Fear, the instrument that had built his power, was now the only language he understood. The Ottoman invasion had been repelled, but its aftermath left Wallachia broken and starving. Villages burned, crops destroyed, roads lined with corpses. Even victory smelled of death. The prince who had terrified an empire found himself surrounded by ruins. His nobles were dead, his soldiers exhausted, his borders exposed. He had won his war but lost his country. Across the border in Hungary, King Matthias Corvinus watched with growing alarm. Once Vlad's ally, the Hungarian monarch began to see the Wallachian ruler not as a bulwark against the Turks, but as a danger to Christendom itself. Ambassadors returned with stories too gruesome to ignore. Towers of impaled bodies, boiling cauldrons filled with flesh, whole villages erased in a single night. Matthias understood politics, not nightmares. And a nightmare cannot be reasoned with. In December 1462, Vlad was captured, betrayed, some said, by his own men, and taken to Buda as a prisoner. The charges were framed as diplomacy, misused funds, rogue actions, breaches of royal conduct. But everyone knew the truth. Vlad had become too monstrous to protect. Even for those who had once called him brother in arms, he was not executed. Instead, Matthias locked him away 12 long years in a Hungarian fortress, a gilded cage where Europe's most feared man vanished into silence. Yet his legend refused to stay confined. While he rotted in captivity, the printing presses of Germany began their work. Pamphlets, woodcuts, and chronicles spilled across Europe, describing his atrocities in lurid detail. Some told of him boiling people alive. Others claimed he roasted children and fed them to their mothers. The stories grew wilder with each retelling, half propaganda, half nightmare. But buried beneath the exaggeration was a grain of truth, a record of calculated terror that had once stopped an empire in its tracks. Vlad's cruelty was real enough to become a symbol, his story spreading faster than the ink could dry. By the time he was released around 1475, the world had already transformed him into a monster. Yet the man who stepped from prison was not the same one who had entered. Age had dulled neither his ambition nor his rage. When political chaos in Wallachia opened a path back to the throne, Vlad seized it. But his second reign was brief, a flicker of the old terror, before it burned out forever. That winter, 1476, his army marched to battle once more. Accounts differ, some say he fought the Ottomans, others that he faced rival factions backed by his own brother, Radu the Handsome. Somewhere amid the frozen forests of Wallachia, the dragon's son met his end. His body was never found with certainty. His head, it is said, was sent to Sultan Mehmed II, preserved in honey, displayed on a pike before the gates of Constantinople. A fitting end, perhaps, for a man who had built his empire upon the stake. But death did not silence him. In monasteries and marketplaces, in taverns and courts, his name lingered: Dracula, the Impaler, the voivode of the dead. To peasants, he became a folk hero who defended the land against foreign invaders. To scholars, a cautionary study in tyranny. And to storytellers, a bottomless well of dread. 3 centuries later, in 1897, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker would borrow that name Dracula and dress it in the supernatural garments of Victorian fear. His vampire was immortal, elegant, and damned, feeding on blood as Vlad had fed on terror. Yet what made the legend endure was not the fangs or the immortality. It was the truth that had inspired it, the reminder that real monsters are born from human choices, not from myths. For historians, Vlad remains an unsolved paradox. Was he a patriot defending his homeland through terror, or a psychopath drunk on cruelty? Perhaps he was both. The 15th century was a world where survival demanded savagery. To live, one had to terrify those who would prey upon the weak. Vlad merely perfected the art and paid the price for it. Modern psychologists studying his reign note a chilling duality, strategic sadism. His tortures were not random outbursts of madness, but deliberate tools of policy. Every stake, every execution, every spectacle was part of a logic, however perverse, that equated fear with control. In his mind, terror was efficiency, pain was order. And yet, as history would prove, fear cannot govern forever. A reign built on agony eventually collapses under its own weight. His people obeyed him, yes, but they never loved him. His allies respected his cunning but never trusted him. His enemies feared his name but waited patiently for his ruin. In the end, Vlad's kingdom became what he himself had once been: a hostage to terror. Centuries later, the forests where his victims once hung have returned to silence. The wind whispers through the trees, and travelers claim that on certain nights, when the moon is pale and the mists are low, the land still remembers. The air carries an unease, as if the soil itself knows what it once absorbed. Vlad the Impaler's story is not just the tale of a cruel ruler, it is a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human nature. It shows how easily righteousness can decay into obsession, how fear, once unleashed, consumes even those who wield it. His reign achieved what few others in history have. He ruled not only a nation, but the imagination of the centuries that followed. He proved that a name can outlive a body, that horror can become heritage, and that power without conscience is the truest form of damnation. The forests he filled with bodies have long since turned to dust, but the shadow he cast remains. And as long as humans tell stories of cruelty, power, and vengeance, the name Dracula will never truly die.